Recording.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our fourth of 7 Cyber Phenomena Roundtables for 2025. Today's subject is privacy risks, the data privacy lifecycle cradle to grave. I'm Mike Sheehan. I'm a board member of ISC2, and I organize this roundtable series for a number of different communities, including ISC2, ATEC, ISA, ISACR, and InfraGard, along with the Phenomenati team, including today's facilitator and managing director of Phenomenati, Scott Foote. Today we have another amazing panel, which includes Adriana Winkler, Bill Bowman, Jennifer Sanders, and Matthew Coleman. Adriana is a recognized leader in information security and data protection officer with extensive experience implementing and managing risk, privacy, and data protection frameworks for multinational corporations on a global scale. She currently leads risk and privacy regulatory initiatives at Accenture in the United States. Previously, Adriana led privacy and data protection programs across Latin America, the Middle East, and Asia for leading US-based companies valued over $50 billion, serving clients such as McDonald's, Coca-Cola, Subway, and Pizza Hut. Bill Bowman is an operating partner in CISO at the private equity firm Welsh Carlson. Bill helps the portfolio companies with security, risk, compliance, privacy, and counter-fraud activities. He has publicly stated that data privacy is his love language. Very good, Bill. Founding president of ISC2 Eastern Mass, and previously has served as CISO at Emburus as software, and also as chief security officer at Zoom Info. Jennifer Sanders, sorry, I'm not going in order, folks, but I think you can tell by the pictures and the names. Jennifer Sanders is an attorney practicing law for technology companies for the past 25 years, supporting product and development teams with a focus on privacy. Jen has worked in companies ranging from Fortune 500 companies to mid-size and startups, including Oracle, Accenture, VC-backed startups, and most recently just departed the weather company. Matthew Coleman is a partner in the law firm Orrick, Harrington, and Sutcliffe. He advises on audits, litigates, and researches complex multi-jurisdictional privacy, cybersecurity, and information governance issues. Matthew develops global privacy and cybersecurity programs to meet state, federal, and international laws and self-regulatory regimes, and identifies and mitigates risks during mergers and acquisitions. Today's facilitator, Scott Foote, as mentioned, is the managing director of Phenomenati, where he serves as the CISO, the data protection officer, chief information risk officer, and chief artificial intelligence officer for Phenomenati's clients, helping guide their security investments and risk strategies. With 35 years in cybersecurity and tech leadership, he's led teams of 10 to 1,000 specializing in systems architecture and digital transformation. We have a lot of material to cover today, so if you have any questions, you can put them in chat, and if we get to them, we can follow up with you. With all that being said, please join me in welcoming today's briefing facilitator, Scott Foote. Scott, take it away.
Thanks, Mike. You forgot that I empty the trash at Phenomenati as well, too. So what I thought we would do to kick this off is to just lay out a framework. This is just a framework we use at Phenomenati. It's not one that's generally published or anything like that. You can find it at Data Privacy Lifecycle.com. That's just a link to a blog post that I have put out. And if you like the graphic I'm going to build here, you can grab it off of that. But I thought we would lay this out. This is by no means intended to constrain our conversation, but just to get started in terms of thinking of the entire life cycle of data, and the fact that adopting any framework is a useful way of launching a program and frankly selling it internally, as most of us on this call have had to do multiple times in our career. So like any good framework, it starts with the data subject in the center. Who is our data subject? What is the data we're going to collect about them? And it always comes back to what are the risks to the rights and freedoms of those natural people. I'm sorry to quote GDPR, but I love that line because it hits strong in the boardroom and with the executive teams that I coach or participate on. Beyond that, though, something that we can't avoid it in today's space, and this will be my first question I ask our panel to pontificate on, is this idea of data sovereignty and how it's evolving with international privacy law all over the world. And at least it's been my experience, and I said we'll dive into it, that this is sometimes an afterthought to most of the people that I start to engage with. They understand privacy is an obligation, but they don't start with the sovereignty of where the human is sitting when we begin collecting data. So I'm going to ask our panel to talk about that in a minute. The next is a thing I find very, very useful whenever I'm working with any of the supervisory authorities around Europe, for example, or South America, and frankly, even in Singapore, is this idea of a data flow diagram. Please, if you're not doing them for our audience, if you're not doing them, please make the investment. These become invaluable if you have a breach to be able to explain what is the flow. I like this format. I've shared this format with a couple of the ICOs or supervisory authorities across Europe, and they have handed it out to small companies. But I always start with the data subject at the top, whoever the controller is, and the controller's processors layered below that. And I think it was Bill that had just asked earlier when we were walking through the material. I also include, are we transferring across borders? Is the PII being transferred across borders in any one of these communication exchanges? Because of course, those exchanges are going to need to be protected. And we'll get into that as part of the session. But if you're interested in following up on DFDs, reach out to any of us on this particular panel. But I would say that is a fundamental place to start. If you're not doing it, you really do want to make the investments there. Of course, PIAs and DPIAs, fundamental to everything we do in terms of establishing programs around that. And then the life cycle begins with the traditional collection, minimization, anonymization, which is usually pseudonymization, at least according to law. It's very difficult to fully anonymize. And then what are we doing with the data? What do we have rights to? What have we provided notice for? What are we doing in terms of establishing transparency? All the way through to the AI uses, is it explainable? Not just transparent, but is it explainable? Don't forget the ecosystem of everyone that we share that data with, all the way down to bare metal, where are we storing the data? How long are we going to store the data with data retention? And fundamentally, when and how will we destroy the data? Notice I didn't say delete, I said destroy the data, because we need to legally be able to represent. We have done that according to all the obligations, contractual, legal, ethical obligations. Space that I think we're going to talk about a fair amount here is how do we handle these subject access requests? Most clients that I've dealt with have a tendency to dive right in, and they make a couple of mistakes until they get advice from folks that you see like on our panel. Of course, privacy audits. I don't hear that much about it in terms of requirements, but we've all been doing security audits for decades now. Privacy audits are becoming fundamental. I wind up getting pulled in on these types of audits for M&A due diligence. That's something maybe Bill, you could talk a bit about that from the PE background. We'll get into that. And in my nirvana, I have these two wonderful pillars holding up this entire kind of a framework where we're actually doing privacy engineering all the way through to privacy operations with dedicated, qualified individuals and resources to make sure that our organization is doing everything that we should be doing, not just obligatory, but ethically in terms of protecting this data. So that's a graphic. As I said, if anybody wants this picture, I'm going to take this down so we can all see the full panel. But you can find it at dataprivacylifecycle.com. It's, as I said, it's just a link to a blog on Phenomenati's website. If you're looking for more information, I'm happy to share that. So unless anybody wants to comment on the graphic first, why don't I take this down and let's dive into the panel. Anybody still need the picture up?
We reserve the right to have you bring it back up after.
Well, I've printed copies for everyone's refrigerator, Bill, so I expect to see it on yours at some point. Here, let me come back to the panel. And Mike, am I no longer sharing? Are we back to the panel view? Okay, you're muted, Mike, but that's okay. I got you. So guys, if that's the landscape of where all these problems are, let me start in the center and let's spiral out. Let's talk a little bit about data subjects and about the sovereignty issues. I'm looking for experience you guys have had bringing companies from a state of, let's just say, less of a focus on privacy to, more enlightenment, starting with the individuals. Are they even really tracking all the individuals? Are they building the inventories? And do they fundamentally understand the sovereignty issues? Let me start with Adriana. I know you've spent as much time as really any of us working internationally, but what's your experience been in this space? And then we'll come around. I'll make sure that I can touch base with everybody on this topic because I know we've all had experiences, good, bad, and ugly. But
Okay,
Adriana.
thanks. Yeah, okay, thanks, and hi, everyone. So we are talking about our data rights and also each country's ability of, just I'm not talking legal, but also to comply with, the data, our own personal data, and apply to our day-to-day, business or whatever. So we have basically infrastructure and also internal policies that we can also apply, and then we can just have basic foundation for our day-to-day data flow, data use, whatever. But the data is ours. So it's not like the company's data. So that's where problems begin because some companies, they just ignore regulations and frameworks and everything else, and they just want to collect all data possible, and then go from there. And that cannot happen anymore in today's world. So if we look at the roadmap, I would say that probably 90% of the countries, they have some sort of data privacy regulation, happening now as of today. I'm not even talking about United States where we have like for each state, like regulations here and there and everywhere. So let's just put this aside and go back to the global scenario, So it's I like saying that, complying with privacy does not block you from doing business or innovating or doing anything else. But we have requirements that we have to put in place in order to operate. Because other than that, you're gonna be subject to fines, to trust issues. You're gonna lose your clients. Your business is not gonna even be able to operate. So there's a lot of consequences of not dealing properly with personal data. Okay, I'll step here and then it just food for thought. And then of course our panelists can just bring more information because we are like 6 people talking and we only have an hour.
Yeah, Scott, I'll jump in.
Jennifer.
Yeah, our most recent work with Weather Company, because it's a publisher and that's what it's all about, is advertising to users. So very conscious of where the users are, because we look at where your users are to find out which laws apply and where you're operating, both on how you collect the data and if you're going to be transferring it anywhere. And so how you collect it, where you're transferring it, and then what you can do based on how you've collected it. So companies need to decide just holistically, like if you're in the US, do you want to partition off each state or certain high sensitivity states and not do certain activities in those states, which gets super cumbersome in the operational process part or the product build part? Or do you want to take the highest levels and apply it across the nation or that area? So again, you have to decide which controls are going to apply. And then we have, again, if you're doing that in Europe, it's going to be, we have different requirements. You have the frameworks for collecting in legitimate basis and legal basis for using data there and advertising, and they're a little bit different. You can see the enforcement authorities are coming down differently there. So keeping an eye on that, where your sensitivities are. And then in addition to just operating legally, as attorneys, we look at risk basis, right? So I'm not going to look at it and go, you have to do X, Y, Z necessarily. I'm going to say, let's look at what we're doing and what's a real risk and what's not. And so some companies are going to be really high on that risk factor. They just have targets on their back. So, but it's definitely like you can operationally partition these things. And then I'm going to turn over to somebody else to talk about, but that's what we dealt with a lot. That was very challenging.
I love the fact you pointed out this should be a risk-based discussion. And by the way, if it doesn't go without saying, our audience should not consider any of the comments that any of us make as legal advice for this particular conversation. So I'm sure the attorneys will all weigh in on that as well. But it's an excellent point, Jennifer. The PIAs and the DPIAs are meant for us to really examine where is the risk. If we're just capturing someone, say, an email ID, there is risk in that. But is it as bad as capturing their date of birth and their government issued, credential or something like that? Obviously, there's higher risk. But I think in this particular space, I'm curious if Matthew or Bill, if you guys have seen anybody actually label the data when they collect it. As Jennifer says, we need to be transparent with where are we regionalizing the code as it's coming out. We need to find out where are they? Are they in Idaho or are they in Slovenia? bottom line though is, do you see clients, and I've not seen this until I've insisted on it with our clients. Have you seen companies actually label the data so that we can apply the appropriate international law to the handling of that PII?
Right. Matthew, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. So I will say that I'm going to give you the classic lawyer answer of it depends. But it does depend on the size of the organization, the level of resources that they have to be able to manage multiple different localized compliance programs, right? Most companies that we work with, particularly growing and emerging companies, they're going to take a one size but line of best fit approach to compliance, where they have one set of rules that they're going to manage across the board with. It's called like 80-20 compliance, where they're going to get 80% of the way there. And if they apply the rules, they may have some tweaking to do along the margins in particular jurisdictions if they get an access request or a deletion request in from a certain place, figuring out what the rules are that they have to apply to responding to that type of a request. But when it comes to bringing data inbound, it's really the much larger organizations, the more sophisticated organizations that have data lakes, data management platforms, data layers on top that can handle the kind of metadata that you're talking about to understand where the data actually originated from, location it originated from, if it's a B2B provider, the customer that it originated from, the rights that they might have to be able to use that data for particular purposes, which really comes into play if you're talking about like training AI models or using data for improving products and services. Being able to tag the data that you get in the door with, all of that fascinating metadata really enables the business to grow and to accelerate. It's just not something that is feasible in all cases for growing and emerging companies.
That's an excellent point, Bill. I know you oversee a very large portfolio of portcos. So what's your experience been in this space for the smaller businesses?
Yeah, I tell you, I love being the non-attorney on this call. So as a person who has who's had to actually go and do this, I realized coming out of Jennifer's comment about the DPIA, that really for us was what allowed us to really move forward. Just immediately identifying the type of data that we're holding. Is this for the enterprise? Are we a data controller in this environment? Are we a data processor in this relationship? Tagging it effectively here, understanding where that data came in from and where it's going and where we're storing it, of course, to those geographic boundaries that you mentioned earlier. GDPR really has helped us in this space identify where that data is. I've done this exercise at each of the companies that I've been in a post-GDPR environment. And with that said, it really has given us a focus on what we can do with the data and what we cannot do with the data. And it helps me work to educate the data owners so they understand what data we have, how we're classifying it, where we're holding it, and also adding in that whole expiration piece and that whole life cycle. So to me, that is how we've been able to flex our data muscle, if you will.
If I could add one point on that, because Bill, I think you're 100% right. I think as you're thinking about companies that are going up the maturity scale, right, that first layer may be adding in processes so that when a new product gets spun up or a new vendor relationship gets spun up, you have some kind of documentation process like a PIA that captures what is the data, how is it being used, and you have it feeds directly into a record of processing activities or a data inventory. And you have the documentation to say, this is the data within our ecosystem, cradle to grave. The next layer beyond that would be, how do you automate that? How do you create a system using existing tools, data layers to be able to, again, like read that metadata to be able to apply the controls in a more automated way? And that's challenging.
And literally, we did do this. Oops, sorry for cutting you, but I just wanted to stay on this point for 1 second. We literally did this. We utilized the technology. I can't say necessarily the name, but we'll say it rhymes with Mendo. And we approved them to one part of our environment. And we said, third-party risk management, if the use of this data changes, then you have to come through the whole process again and help us understand how you're changing that. So because we had that in place and because we had the data owner responsible as a responsible adult at the table, identified that, oh, we are going to actually now change it. We're going to use this for potential marketing purposes. We immediately put it right back in through the mixer. And it was all because of the way that you said that was the reason why we were able to do so. So sorry for cutting whoever it was that I spoke over.
No. I just wanted to reiterate what you were saying there, both of you were saying there, for the audience to understand this. This is a cross-functional review and ownership and understanding. So like you'll have attorneys in one area, product engineers somewhere else, compliance, processing, and what everyone's describing here is very multifunctional, and that is what makes this work. And the other one is that both Matthew and Bill said is ownership, accountability. You'll see so many of these things, like a process will be signed off, a PIA will be signed off. Who ultimately owns that? As you said, Bill, if there's any changes, because that's also very strong in governance here. So it's all of that. And then it's another really good point you had is like looking at where the data comes in. Is it licensed from another company, a vendor? So are you using it as a sub-processor, processor, or a controller? Huge difference in what you're doing there and your rights. So really understand that. And I think when some of the local, I'm in California, when CPRA and those things came out, I think a lot of people had problems understanding the difference there for some odd reason. But so making sure, and then it's not just done by attorneys and written in paper and put in a drawer, that really your teams, again, cross-functional, understand what's going on.
I just want to add something because, I mean, when we talk about PIAs and DPIAs, I mean, we are talking about an ideal world. But if you look at the majority of companies around the world, they have no clue what is a PIA or DPIA. And it's hard, because we try to, of course, us, when we are working and we say, okay, let's suppose I want to just put a facial recognition system in my company because I need more security. And then under many regulations, we have to do a DPIA for that because this is a high risk activity. And okay, how long does it take to put a DPIA in place? And at the same time, other teams are just buying the equipments. They're getting ready to install the cameras. They are very happy. And then that comes us like data protection officers. Okay, let's stop, let's pause, and let's put the DPIA in, let's just do the DPIA. And for smaller companies or even medium-sized companies, I mean, they don't have this process in place, So again, we are talking about the ideal world where everything is like, happening and, we have the life cycle happening, but that's where we are needed most because, this is just an example of how important is conduct DPIA, for example. So
I see this challenge with every new client, even the ones that don't come to us for privacy. When we initially do a risk register, of course, there are privacy risks. So what we try to do is very lightweight because there's active resistance, right? And even the larger companies, there is this tacking back and forth between, as Adriana's described, they want to be responsive, yet we're asking them to be more responsible, right? To don't take advantage of the data without the appropriate permissions and legal basis and transparency, et cetera, et cetera. And I'll tell you, this is how I arrived at the DFD diagram because it was cross-functional the way Jennifer's describing. I had a lot of people in the room and I was using, cybersecurity engineer. I was using technology language and it was lost on 3/4 of the people in the room. They were just, eyes rolling back in their head, like, what is this individual talking about? So I started to draw those simple stick diagrams. And then without saying, we're going to do a PIA or a DPIA, I'd say to maybe be the attorney, I'd say, Matthew, what if that was your PII? And I was taking it through this food chain. Are you concerned that I haven't done a vendor assessment on that company that's doing the facial recognition? I try to make it personal in the moment. So they're engaged in the process, but I give them a simple diagram that lets them really understand that's the data element. And here are all the organizations all over the world that might touch it in any shape or form, even encrypted. That's how I usually start a PIA, Adriana, for an organization that doesn't have the resources, experience, and frankly, they're, gun shy in terms of spending the money. Then what I'll do is tell them after the fact, you've just done your first PIA. Now let's talk about the risk threshold to really go into the more technical side of the controls. Have we gone past a high risk threshold? And usually it's my counterpart, the GC, that will explain what is a risk threshold in terms of that business entity. It all comes back though to trying to make this lightweight so that they're not afraid of doing it and that they will participate. I usually have to draw the diagrams and I ask other people to go and grade my homework. But when I bring them through a lightweight TIA, they'll say that wasn't too bad. That was, frankly, a lot better than going to the dentist. And then, Bill, to your point, when we make a change and I ask them to come back, they're like, "Oh, we did that. I remember doing that. Q1, we did that over coffee. Yeah, let's do it." They dive in. If you set the bar too high, you get active resistance all over the place. At least that's been my experience. So I think that's something our audience really should take away is however you do it, you should be doing TIAs and transcending to a DPIA, but start with the simple diagram like a DFD to get everybody, as Jennifer says, that cross-functional team, get them on the same page so that they're actively involved rather than just passively or avoiding the conversation. So the next thing I wanted to talk about as we spiral outward a little bit is another place where I see a lot of companies trip up. Minimization, well, collection period. Let's talk about that in terms of minimization, anonymization, pseudonymization. I've always got the marketing people in the room and they say blood type. I want to know this person's DNA strand. They want everything about the human demographics. What can we figure out from their IP address, et cetera, et cetera. I'm like, whoa, slow down. Wait a minute. I can't take the inventory fast enough, but you start asking the question, why? The reason why I bring it up here is because I find it's most effective when we start at the beginning and minimize the data to only that which we need for the proposed processing. But what have been your experiences, team? Matthew, how about you in terms of this idea of starting with less in spite of the appetite being literally everything?
Yeah, no, it's a great question and a perennial one. The real gating question for me is why? What do you need this information for? There may be a reason where you actually do need some level of health data for marketing purposes. Say, for example, if you need to recruit for a clinical trial and you want to have basic claims from the whoever the sponsor is and use that for advertising. It's good to know that because then there's a whole bunch of other regulatory hoops that you have to jump through in order to be able to get there. But knowing the why is essential to figure out what is appropriate in terms of the level of data that you need in order to be able to perform the function. And it all starts from there. And so if the why doesn't add up, you don't need DNA strands for a marketing campaign, then that just gives you fodder. It's the principle of data minimization has been around since the 50s and the 70s, and it's now recycled into every privacy law that we see get spun up from the GDPR to all the US state privacy laws. Like, it's not a novel concept. It is just something that the business needs to be educated on, that the more data you're processing, the more data you're collecting without a specified purpose for it, the bigger target you are also for a data breach. And the more risk you're carrying if that data is ever compromised. So that helps, put some perspective on the business teams that if that's cost of that data breach is going to come out of your spend, then, it gets real pretty quickly.
Yeah, making it personal in terms of, what is the risk equation there? What is the benefit that the business might actually experience? The data subject as well. Jennifer, you pointed out personalization, regionalization. These are fundamental to understanding who we're interacting with over the web. But then what is the risk? What if that breach actually happens? So, Jennifer,
I was
go
going
ahead.
to say, something I like, it's people not being siloed, again, back to the cross-functional. So as Matthew's talking about here, like, you'll have people come and say, we're going to get personal data. And so you want different stakeholders to go, what kind of personal data? Like, what are the data categories and how are we going to use that? So are we combining it? Certain things aren't going to be sensitive on their own, but if you're combining them, they will be. And health data and the new health data laws, those can be somewhat onerous. It's just another step to do it, but you don't have to be doing clinical trials. You can be offering advertising to pharma companies, and they want to know, can they advertise on your site? Well, we might know where you're having allergies. All of a sudden that becomes health data. So it can get really complex, but the thing I come at this a lot from a product attorney side, which is when the stakeholders are in the room and we really understand what the intent is or the desire, then we can talk about it and go, is there another way to get there? Is there a different way to get to that? What's the desired goal here? Or is this, is the risk too high? Usually we can get there some other way. So just so that the parties understand, because, and I guess, as you said, Scott, we're not always all speaking the same languages. So when you get the people in the room talking together, you can understand, how does this affect product? How does this affect process? What is legal? When I say something and it glazes over for you, like, let's And again, legal requirements don't always 100% keep up or easily overlay on everything that's happening. That's another big issue you can get into, again, with anonymization, pseudo-anonymization, things like that in this space. What is that? Like, those are technical requirements, and it doesn't, an attorney saying it may not make sense in the use case, like directly makes sense. So you have to talk to the stakeholders. What does this really mean? What are we doing?
We talk to stakeholders that have the appetite that Matthew talked about earlier, right? They want it all. They want to take all that data. What I will usually do is I won't be resistant up front, but I will draw, usually on a whiteboard, I will draw the data lake or data warehouse that somebody had mentioned earlier, maybe it's you, Matthew, but I don't label it a data lake, or maybe I'll label it a data lake and then I erase it and I write privacy, pinata. Boy, does that make a statement in the room when they're like, what are you talking? Why were you? Because I have to think like the adversary in terms of the risks. We keep collecting all this data, but it all comes back to the fact that we're basically fattening the pig up to bring it to market. That's certainly what adversaries think about. But I'm curious to get Bill and Adriana's perspective on this idea of trying to minimize as much as possible before we launch into more robust, controls across the whole spectrum.
I can go. I mean, I don't have much else to add at this point, but I think also we should think of privacy by design principles too, because if you can have the same results with less data, it's the way you should go, So, and also another thing to add to what Matthew just said, I mean, the more data that you have, it's more expensive for your company because you have to have more storage, you have to have more cloud or whatever space, So it's not only for data breaches, of course, this is a very, but I also like saying that everything that you can fix with money, it's okay, but it's not the case with data, personal data, because we are talking about reputation. So, I'm gonna just pay the fine. I have a very high risk appetite, so whatever. No, so it's reputation we're talking about. So companies that, they, of course, we never forget, specific cases in the past, that company, they breached my data. I'm not going, do business with them again because, so this is where we should, stop and think, okay, why do I need this much data? And just another example, in another country, they used to ask your social security number for everything you would do. You would go to buy a concert ticket. Oh, what's your security number? And see, and this is like, it's not, of course, today with the new data protection law in that country, I'm talking about Brazil, LGPD, it's no longer allowed anymore. But still, some companies insist in collecting, this much data for many purposes, which they shouldn't, do. So I'll stop here.
But everyone has that appetite. Bill, do you have any thoughts before we jump to the next topic?
Yeah, I do. At the end of last year, I reached out to Aon, Chubb, and Lockton, and I say, walk me through what's going on right now. What are you paying out as it relates to cybersecurity? And each one said, oh, it's CPRA fines on pixels and marketing pixels and what companies are doing in this area. I said, oh my gosh, it's a total blind spot for me. Didn't show up on my DPIAs, didn't show up anywhere in some of the work that I was doing, but sure enough, this is an area of major exposure for companies. So with that, I had a chance to go right back to the marketing teams, like, guys, what the hell are you collecting in here? Why are you putting us in such a risk position? So through that lens, being able to minimize data and doing it from that risk side, that you understand what those dollar amounts are going to be, that's one way that you can take a look at minimizing your risk profile.
I like the fact that Adriana pointed out privacy by design is what we're talking about. This is kind of the left-hand side of my cycle diagram where we're doing the engineering and trying to get in front of the problem, minimizing, anonymizing, pseudonymizing, make sure that it can't be reconstructed, to Jennifer's point, that we aren't, simply separating it, but it can still be reconstructed after the fact. These are all challenges up front, but let's slip over. Adriana, you started to talk about this a little bit. Privacy operations isn't just about managing the PII, it's also about the cost. In terms of what are we collecting, where are we storing it? We might be, in fact, in most cases today, a lot of this data is collected internationally, but it's moved to data centers. And at least on the high end of our customer base, the data centers are now being appropriately located around the world, call it an AWS zone environment. They will appropriately set up where they collect the data from, it stays in country. That doesn't mean they don't reach in and use it, which of course is another transfer. We usually have to explain that. But at least the pinatas are separated around regionally rather than having that one giant pinata full of data, that's centralized usually in the US. But operations in general, who has it? Where are we storing it? What is the sovereignty? And what's everyone's experience here in terms of real retention policies where we enforce them? I find people have, at least when we first meet them, they don't have any retention policy whatsoever. Or if they do, it's mixed in with something else difficult to find, and it hasn't been operationalized. Because although the great ideas were all there on the engineering side, the ops side, the seats are empty. There is no function. Sometimes it's slipped under the CISO. The DPO has a responsibility, but day to day, are we keeping our PIAs up to date? Are we keeping our inventories and our ROPA up to date? Are we actually doing what we are legally supposed to do in terms of not retaining forever, but deleting it or destroying it? What have your experiences been across the board? And Matthew, let me come back to you on this one. Are you seeing people establish anything like this, or it's still pretty much a pickup game?
In terms of the specific regionalization and having really eyes on target for the full data lifecycle?
Well, yes, I was thinking in terms of just ops people that at least fractionally are committed to maintaining privacy operations. But
Yeah.
let's focus on the topic you just brought.
Yeah, no, sure. And harking back to what Jennifer had said earlier, it was really, it can't just be privacy. It can't just be legal, right? We can tell you what the law says, but it actually takes operational people to be able to implement the technical controls to make it happen. So, even the idea of data retention necessarily sitting in security, although it is a security function, it's so, embedded within the internal IT infrastructure itself, right? Like each system is going to have its own retention schedule. It's going to have its own retention configurations that need to be implemented. And IT is usually the one to be able to do that. The other piece is understanding kind of the regulatory overlay of what kind of data are you processing, what kind of record retention requirements are you subject to, and being able to craft a really detailed schedule that can then be automated into each of the systems. That's just, again, like a collaboration point between legal and information security and IT. It requires kind of everyone playing in the same sandbox. In terms of like privacy operations, yeah, that's certainly part of it as well. Of the policy gets set by either the legal team or the compliance team, and then the operational folks have to be the ones to go out and make sure that it happens, make sure that they're educating the business that when they're buying new systems and new IT vendors, that they have these kinds of capabilities, that they're able to be configured appropriately, that we understand what data is being processed within those systems, that if there are any cross-border transfers, so that they can raise that up the flagpole, and the lawyers can try and address any of the risks, or opine on what the policy should be. Yeah, I just emphasize that it's a full court press between all of the different business units within the organization to make that happen.
Yeah, can I jump? Something
Please,
there.
Jennifer.
Something that, just to be clear to the audience, we're talking about different levels of maturity in companies. So like all of this, again, you're going to be looking at the level of maturity, but what Bill is just talking about with pixels is a real problem, and we can expand that out to your vendors, right? So a lot of times those are your third-party vendors. So you have this as part of the chart. It's like, who are your vendors and what are they doing? So understanding those on your site, because a lot of people, again, legal will operate in a vacuum, allow you to put pixels on the site. And you've seen major cases around these recently, the big breaches around using Facebook tools on sites, and it turns out they had dropped pixels on hospitals, right? So it's understanding what your vendors are doing, and as Matthew said, bringing new vendors on board. What are they doing? What have you brought them on board to do, and what's their part in any life cycle with data? So again, just understand what your actual environment is.
Making sure the left hand is talking to the right. Yeah, doesn't happen.
That data map in terms of when there are changes, right? Or when somebody asks to be forgotten. We're going to talk about SARS in a minute, but data in terms of the privacy operations, I like to ask people, if I asked you as an individual, can you tell me all of your systems and all of your vendors that currently hold a piece of my PII? With only one exception, notable Fortune 10 company, they've never been able to answer me at all. The concept hasn't even been instantiated. And certainly, Jennifer, to your point, the less mature, less large the entity is, this is a completely foreign concept, but it's an important one in order to truly be able to adhere to all of these obligations across the board, not just the legal and regulatory, but contractual ones.
Can I?
But Adrienne and Bill, do you guys want? I'm sorry, Matthew.
I was just going to add something to something you just said, Scott, so it's interesting to me is also the idea of particularly B2B companies where you're selling into either a B2C company or some other business. Under legal obligations like GDPR, DPA obligations, you need to make it known who your sub-processors are, which of your vendors have access to personal information. And so, it is, if it's not even, necessarily the legal risks are going to make the business move, the market pressures certainly will, because their buyers are going to require that in every single one of their contracts. So yeah, starting with an exercise to understand what vendors have their hand in the cookie jar is a pretty important first step.
Yeah, let me just compliment you on the vendor side. So my experience, I have been talking to many CISOs and CIOs and C-levels everywhere, and sometimes they think that they know their vendors on the cyber perspective, like, okay, no, my vendors, they have like grades, good grades, like scores, A and Bs or whatever. And a cyber assessment is not the same as a privacy assessment, and also this is very important, to make it clear, because they like say, oh, I do all my homework, I assess them, but do you assess them under the privacy regulations perspectives or so? And they say no. So this is one thing. So we need to make sure that our vendors, they have a good privacy compliance standard. This is one thing. Going back to that facial recognition case, let's say that. So they in data transfers. So okay, and then do you know where the data is going to? And many companies, this data is going to countries that we are not sure about their practices. Practices like, for example, China. They have privacy regulations, they are there, but they have different standards than us in the rest of the world sometimes. So that's why we have systems and tools that got banned from the United States because they don't comply with our standards. So you have to make sure that you have the assessment done, so you can say yes or no to this specific vendor also. So this is my point of view on this.
Now, Gianna, that point about the vendors, I've talked to a lot of security people. As their DPO, I will talk to my peer, my equivalent on the security side, and I'll say, so show me your vendors. Okay, there's your list. Talk about their privacy operations. They'll say, no, cybersecurity is all good. I said, I didn't ask that. Yeah. Let's start with going to something like the EU's enforcementtracker.com. I love this site. Yeah, not just because it's constantly got fresh data on it, but because it makes this point very clear. Their security could have been fine, but they didn't adhere to the principles, and they've been fined 10,000 euros, 10 million euros. This is your vendor. You are entrusting data for your data subjects to this data processor. Know your data processors in the space. I think that's
reputation. Yeah.
Because you can't buy trust.
Yeah.
I think you made that point earlier. Trust cannot be bought. But Bill, your thoughts on this before I bring us around to subject access requests.
Excellent. I had 5, actually I had 3, but then it went to 5 as you guys kept on talking. Number 1 was reporting lines. Where are your decision makers? Who do these people report to? Scott, in your open, you were talking about IT and legal and security and CISOs. And as you were saying all that, I was like, well, if someone reports into a reporting line where the leader, this possibly the CIO, just wants to punch you down like whack-a-mole, or are you actually reporting into a risk line? Does the security DPO report into legal, or is legal the DPO in that space? Then what type of clout does he or she have across the board? Reporting lines really do play a major part in this, along with your data governance structure. So do you have a data privacy steering committee? Do you have some type of a governance structure in place? So being able to understand what those pieces are is critically important. And then making sure that you have that visibility to report exactly how you're doing to that ELT or to that board. That then ties the whole thing around reporting line. Second one was around the data deletion. Huge. It's a significant challenge to do. Companies that are able to do this correctly, it might just be a piece of paper that says we have a data deletion policy. That's really cute. But the reality is you need to have the whole data deletion matrix in play, understanding what is the useful life of every piece of data that you have in there. And you have that mechanism to actually delete the data that's in there without necessarily ruining your whole company. I often give the analogy of a famous company that allowed their customers to pay a premium to have their data deleted. Upon the data breach, they realized that not only did people pay money to have their data deleted, it actually never got deleted. So that's an incredibly embarrassing piece. And then I also remind companies that after a customer leaves, do you want to have to send them a reintroduction letter several years later saying, oh, by the way, we never actually deleted your data and we had a data breach event? So making sure you understand what those pieces are like is critically important. Identifying if your company is doing things well, then using it as a marketing strength to identify that you have privacy as a differentiator inside of your area. So as you're inside of your vertical, to be able to say that you treat your data better than your competitors is a real superpower to have that I don't think a lot of people are flexing that muscle. And then number 4 was looking at the sub-processors. Absolutely, Matthew, what you said in there was absolutely crucial. And for me, it's taking that next step around educating all of your different data owners and also your business owners for different vendors who come into play to make sure that you understand that we're going to actually identify this person as a sub-processor, this entity as a sub-processor. We're going to put it up on our public website so every single person who wants to do business with us can see, oh, this is the company, this is their data use, this is where they're doing the data processing, and we make sure that we understand how we're actually using that data. And then finally, we talked about the certifications. So we look at that ISO 27701, or you take a look at a SOC 2 with privacy as your trust principle. Understanding how companies are able to, again, use some of these pieces as that differentiation can help them position their data privacy program as a strength. That all without taking a breath.
We're fitting the elephant in the thimble here today, Bill. Absolutely. Those are really excellent points on the data retention problem. That is clearly a very complex issue, right? Maintaining the matrix, and it's not two-dimensional, it's multi-dimensional. But knowing when to delete and doing so in a reliable way to destroy, not just delete, but to destroy. There's also the opposite of that, and I invite the attorneys to weigh in on this, but when you get a legal hold for data on a particular individual or set of individuals, that I think, Jennifer, you talked about that data map and just how complex it can be and where all the data elements are. I have found it difficult to work with my GC counterparts when they say legal hold on, Alpha, Beta, Gamma's data, to just reach out and to be able not just to communicate to my information security team, but all of our partners. Hold his data, hold her data, hold this data. And then to actually expire the legal hold, because these things often turn on, but then we never tell the technology or vendors when to turn it off in terms of that legal hold. What have your experiences been with this part of the challenge of privacy operations? Jennifer, you want to jump in first?
Well, I was going to say, I would expand it beyond a legal hold. So there's legal basis for not deleting certain data. So companies don't have to. So that's what, and that's more just for the users to understand and for companies not to overexpand that. So if you look at privacy laws, there's several exceptions. Like you can ask for a deletion request, but we're going to maintain it to comply with laws. That's kind of broad. Or if we're doing transactions, if we have we're selling you something to complete those transactions, sort of an audit history. So for companies to understand, there's not all data will be deleted, and don't go beyond that. So what can you legally hold on to? So, and again, this goes back to, I'm going to go over to Matthew or someone who has more experience on the deletion side, but just for people, I see that on what we advise users in our privacy policies. Like, are we following through with what we've committed to the user?
Thoughts, Matthew, Adriana?
No, I think that's right. I think it's a matter of, I think you guys have already hit it, the fact that that schedule needs to be a living, breathing document, that it, the what regulations you have to comply with are changing, what kind of records you're processing are changing. And having an IT team that is kind of aware of those operational requirements and challenges and has the ability to keep track of the moving targets to the extent there are things like legal holds, or there are certain exceptions that might apply when a deletion request comes in. That's having a protocol to follow for each of those types of scenarios. That's part of maturity. As so if you do get an access request, if you can automate it, great. And so that way you can code in, the exceptions that might apply where I can't give you certain information because it might, violate someone else's privacy rights or whatever it is. Or if you get a deletion request in and I know automatically this information is going to be deleted, this information is going to be obfuscated or pseudonymized, this information we have to retain it in identifiable form because there's a legal reason to do so. And so developing those protocols that are appropriate and keyed to the organization, understanding kind of your own situation, your own legal context, that's all part of maturity.
Yeah, I will also add two things. First of all, a legal hold overrides the data deletion and also we have tools also to help with the legal hold practices. And also it's good to have policies, strong policies that are properly shared internally on the legal hold aspect. But also we are also talking about DSARs, data subject requests. And then this is a part of the whole process because the companies should be able to answer the DSAR. Even the DSAR, they have to even answer, okay, I cannot delete your data because it's on legal hold, but they have to answer that. Sometimes companies, they just forget to answer the request based on the whatever legal hold, or they don't answer. So this is a violation. So again, a DSAR process needs to be very well structured in order to answer whatever request they have. So it's all linked together.
And it's complex, which is why I advocate for that privacy operations. It really does take committed resources that are competent, that understand all these topics we're talking about. And I've seen this happen more than once where an initial implementation of a privacy program, somebody gets a request, I want you to delete my data. To Jennifer's point, they don't completely understand it's a total deletion, and the company starts deleting everything. So it's completely unauditable. I can't prove we deleted the data because the data is now all gone. But here's another one where people will trip up in the subject access requests is they don't authenticate the requester. I ran into, through multiple clients, I ran into an organization about maybe 3 years ago, I think it was 2022, kind of as we were all getting back into the office from COVID. This individual had incorporated a business that did nothing but represent as an agent people. He took his own PII, he knew where it was being collected. He had the agent make the request for the deletion, first for, I want access to it, I want to see what it is, and then for deletion. And he was catching companies that weren't following the procedures and either not responding within the window that was required. I'll tell you, it was in the European Union. But he was also catching them when they didn't authenticate the agent because the requester was a business on behalf of the individual. I'm representing this individual, please delete his or her data. And it was, I mean, it's in the fringes in terms of the real threat actors that we deal with, but it was a nuisance. And those people getting started with their initial programs, they were getting bitten by being too enthusiastic about delete everything, respond to these requests. They weren't following processes.
And
I
let's
think
think
it's
of
fundamental.
and let's think of on the company's side. Okay, I'm getting all these requests, and they have a deadline, a time frame to respond the requests. And also some companies, oh, I have 30 days and I can have even 30 days more. Some countries, they only have 15 days. Like Brazil again. Brazil is the only country that has 15 days to answer a DSAR request. Okay, so and then the company needs to be able to not to answer and also redact any additional information that should not be disclosed. So there is a lot to do when answering a DSAR that needs preparation, needs the appropriate tools and policies. Go ahead.
Most of the laws have the 2 stages where you need to acknowledge the request first.
Yes.
Then you've got 15 to 30 days typically with, legitimate extensions in order to provide the written response, not just the acknowledgement. I've seen companies ignore the need to acknowledge, and they've already violated a regulation
Exactly.
when they haven't responded inside of whatever it is, three days or so.
Yeah.
So I think it's all critical, but these are things that can be started in a less robust way as long as people will follow the rules or follow someone who's done it before. follow people like all of you on this call that have done this before and learn from our experiences of, hey, don't be too enthusiastic, but make sure you are doing what you are obliged to do based on all the way back to the beginning, the data sovereignty of that data subject. So, and we're running down, we've got like 5 minutes left. So what I want to ask everybody, and don't feel like you have to answer the question, but a raise of hands. Who here has actually been involved, no attribution, please, who's been involved with a data breach? Okay, good. I have found many organizations getting advice from entry-level DPOs. And that's the first thing when they ask me, how do they vet a DPO? I say, find someone who has been involved in a breach, not personally, but at least participated in the breach. How do you figure out where the subjects were? My first ransomware event, we had to go through videos to figure out where the data subject might have been when it was collected, the data on that individual was collected. There was no metadata to describe, which is why I asked the question about the metadata labeling before. How do we actually handle the subject access requests? What are our notice requirements in all of those regions? And it takes me back to one piece of advice, and I'm curious to hear what other people think of, but I actually will call the supervisory authorities when I'm first set up as a DPO. I don't just register the letter with them, especially in Europe, but I will reach out and request virtual coffee for 15 minutes as an introductory. Here's who I am. Here's who my client is. And here are the basics on what we do. We're either a consumer business or we deal with the B2Cs that Matthew was talking about. We're a B2B, but we deal with B2Cs. I do it proactively, and I'll tell you the response I've had has been outstanding, because most of these organizations only ever get called when there's a mess. No one calls them proactively.
Scott,
Thoughts
even
on that?
go back maturity wise for companies there, like that's very forward and very mature to do that. I would even back it all out to your incident response plan and your contracts with your vendors. And just being an attorney, I still see contracts that say you will notify us within 48 hours of a breach, period. What's a breach? Notify who? Who owns it? Like who has the right to communicate? What steps are we going to take? That should, depending on your vendor, that should all be spelled out in the contract. So so it's clear, and then carried over into your incident response plan. Like I literally see not a lot done there, a lot. So
I've seen threat actors actually pretending to be large scale, like, I won't say, where they are on the food chain, but they are very well branded names. And it turns out to be the equivalent of a phishing attack where they're reporting privacy breach and they're exploiting the fact that that data controller has no decent IRP to deal with it. So there's no authentication being done. The IRP is now being exposed to the threat actor who is really just doing reconnaissance on their target, but the company's unprepared. Thoughts from other people on do's and don'ts or experiences in actually guiding organizations through a breach response?
Yeah, the one thing I think it's oddly similar between these types of access requests, deletion requests, and also data breaches. You don't want to be figuring it out as you go. Yeah, you don't want to be building the ship while you're flying it. So the best time to put in place a protocol for like either access requests, deletion requests, or data breaches would be, when you can do some slower thinking, you can actually test it. You can actually, follow the whole process from start to finish and see where it might need to be tweaked. On the data breach side, yeah, have your incident response plan in place. Make sure that it's appropriately risk categorized to the actual types of data and the sensitivity and the potential harms to the rights and freedoms of individuals that might occur in the context of a data breach, and then do an actual tabletop exercise. Get your executives in a room and walk through the IRP together with some kind of scenario to see how they would respond and educate them that this is, going to be the kind of stress levels we're going to be under. This is the type of scenario we might have to, negotiate with a ransomware threat actor. And this is the process we're going to follow. And so that when it does happen, you're a little bit more prepared.
Hey, Scott, we're going to have to end it here. I would ask if you could share the URL of the first slide that you put up. That would be great. I've had a number of people ask me for that.
Data Privacy Lifecycle. I'm typing it into the chat session here. Just one word, no spaces, no extensions or anything like that. DataPrivacyLifecycle.com.
All right, any
And I'll
final,
take it to Michael.
yeah, any final comments, Scott, before I
Yeah,
go away?
just right around the board, I want to say thank you to everybody. This is an extremely experienced group of people, obviously selected because they've been there, they've done that, and they truly care about privacy. It's not lip service, as I hope you've seen from all the folks on our call today. This is a big part of what we all do now as a career, and we're committed to it, not just to the data subjects, but to all the data stewards that we represent. So thank you, everybody. Your wisdom, guidance, experience is going to be incredibly valuable to our audience. And I hope we can do another event like this and maybe take it to that next level of maturity that Jennifer was talking about, where, the audience are folks that are deeper into this. So thank you again, everyone. Have a good day. Stay safe online.
Yeah, and I'd like to echo Scott's and thanking the panel. That was a great session. We did record the session for those you might want to review what we talked about or share it with your teammates. We'll get the recording out to you. For those of you who wish to get CPAs and didn't fill out the information when you registered.
CPEs. We can't certify accountants.
CPAs. Thank you, Scott. I appreciate that. If you're interested in talking to any of the panelists, let me know. I'd be happy to facilitate an introduction, or you can reach out to them directly. Our next roundtable is August 27th, Data Sovereignty, the Implications on Business Operations and Business Continuity, at the same time, 12 p.m. And thank you, everyone, for joining us, and enjoy the remainder of the day. And this concludes our briefing. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.